The bright May sunshine illuminated the rolling hills and winding brooks of many waters, casting a silver sheen on the vast expanse of green and purple that bordered the broad river in the bottomlands. The air was thick with a warm summer haze, and the wheat slopes glimmered with hints of gold, promising a bountiful harvest. Marcia Smith perched atop a slope, taking in the fragrant scent of fresh-cut alfalfa and the rustling melody of the wheat. From her vantage point, she could see the stately White House gleaming down on the terraced green knoll, horses and cattle grazing in the pasture, and workmen toiling away in the brown gardens. A motor car crept along the road far below, leaving a trail of rising dust in its wake. 2 miles of soft green wheat slope lay between Marcia and her home. She had sought out the solitude, silence, and memories of a place she had not visited in months. Winter had come and gone, and now summer had arrived with its vibrant birds and blooming flowers. The wheat fields were once again waving in all their lush beauty, but life was not the same for Marcia Smith. The news of Stan Arquette, a private, being mortally wounded, was published in a Spokane newspaper via an Associated Press dispatch of Pershing's casualty list. This was the only news about him for a long time. A month passed with doubt, hope, and slow despairing. Marcia, who had been organizing the women of the valley to work for the interests of the war, barely noticed the fleeting of the days until the fatal announcement. She had thrown herself into the work, becoming a leader who spared no effort, sacrifice, or expense in what she considered her duty. She studied and mastered conservation of food, intensive farm production, knitting for soldiers, Liberty Loans, and Red Cross, leading the women of the valley to accomplish work that won national honor. It was exciting, joyful, and a strange fulfillment for her. However, after the shock of the news about Arquette, she lost interest, though she continued to work harder than ever. Just a night ago, her father called her to his office and told her that she was working too hard and had to quit. She replied that she was only tired that night and wanted to go on. Her father banged his desk and said that she would run herself down. She argued that these were war times and she couldn't do less. Her father acknowledged that she had done wonders and had been the life of the work, but someone else could carry it on now. He didn't want to lose his girl, and he had already bought bonds by the bushel and given thousands to her relief societies. They shouldn't count the cost, but he wasn't going to let her kill herself. I had to give up my son Jim, and it cost us a lot, especially my wife. I'm growing 1 million bushels of wheat this year to give to the government, but I'm starving because I can't afford to eat like I used to. And then came the final blow. Arquette, that young wheat man who was the best. Oh, Marcia. Dad, isn't there any hope? Marcia pleaded with me. I was silent for a moment. You've overworked yourself, now you've got to rest, I said, my voice husky. But Dad. I said no, I interrupted. I have a lot of pride in what you've done. And I think you're the best smith of the lot, that's all. Now kiss me and go to bed. That's how Marcia ended up alone, high up on the vast wheat slope, watching and feeling with no more work to do. The slow climb had proved to her how much she needed rest, but work, even under strain or pain, would have been preferable to endless hours of thinking, remembering, and fighting despair. Mortally wounded, she whispered tragically. When? Where? How had her lover been mortally wounded? That meant death, but no other word had come, and no spiritual realization of death abided in her soul. It seemed impossible for Marcia to accept things as her father and friends did. Nevertheless, it was equally impossible not to be influenced by their practical minds. Because of her nervousness and overstrain, she had lost a good deal of her mental poise, and she divined that the only help for that was certainty of Arquette's fate. She could bear the shock if only she could know positively. And leaning her face in her hands, with the warm wind blowing her hair and bringing the rustle of the wheat, she prayed for divination. No response. There was no mystical awareness of death or the end of her love on this earth. Instead, all around her was a strong physical presence of life. It swelled and waved in the wheat fields, fluttered in the beauty of butterflies, sang in the low birds, and soared in the high eagles. Life beat and surged in her heart and veins, unquenchable and indomitable. It contradicted her morbidness, but it felt like only a physical state. She couldn't find any tangible hold on reality. She lifted her face to the lonely sky, and her hands pressed to her chest where the deep ache throbbed heavily. "It's not that I can't let him go," she whispered, as if compelled to speak. I can. I have let him go. It's this torture of suspense. Oh, not knowing, but even if that newspaper claimed him as one of the killed, I wouldn't believe it. Marcia trusted more in the mystical whisper of her woman's soul than in all the unproven external things. But the voice of the world still rang in her ears, and she was on the rack between the two. The loss of Jim and her mother created unfilled gulfs in her heart. She was someone who loved only a few, but loved them deeply. Today, when they were gone, was different from yesterday when they were here. Yesterday, memory could recall actual words, deeds, and kisses of loved ones whose lives had ended. It was utterly futile for Marcia to try to think of Arquette in that way. She saw his stalwart form through the summer haze, coming with his springy stride through the wheat, and yet the words "mortally wounded" burned into her thoughts so deeply that when she closed her eyes, she saw them, darkly red against the blindness of sight. Pain was a sluggish stream with its source high in her breast, and it moved with her unquickened blood. If Arquette were really dead, what would become of her? It was a selfish question to ask a girl whose lover had died for his country. She knew she had to work hard and be worthy of him. She promised herself that she would never pine and would live to remember him always. But the difference it made to her was immense. She had loved the open, the silken rustle of the wheat and the waving shadows, the green and gold slopes, the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, the voice of child and the sweetness of life. Never again would these be the same to her if Arquette were gone forever. The ache in her heart had consumed her whole being. It filled her mind and her body. Tears stung her eyes, and again they were dry when tears would have soothed her. Just like any other girl, she wept, and then she burned with fever. A longing she had only faintly known, a physical thing which she had resisted, had become real, insistent, beating. Through love and loss, she was being denied a heritage common to all women. A weariness dragged at her. A noble spirit was not a natural thing. It must be intelligence seeing the higher. But to be human was to love life, to hate death, to faint under loss, to throb and pant with heavy sighs, to lie sleepless in the long, dark night, to shrink with unutterable sadness at the wan light of dawn, to follow duty with a laggard sense, to feel the slow ebb of vitality and not to care, to suffer with a breaking heart. As the sun began to set, Marcia realized she had to leave the slope and head back home. Reluctantly, she walked through the grass-grown lane between the sections of wheat. By the time she reached the yard, twilight had fallen, and the cooling air was full of the fragrance of freshly watered flowers. Kathleen, who was growing tall, appeared on the path waiting for her. Marcia couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt as she thought about how little time she had spent with her younger sister. Suddenly, Kathleen came bounding towards her, eyes wide with excitement. "Marcia, I've been waiting for you. I know something, but Dad told me not to tell you," she exclaimed. "Well, then, don't tell me," replied Marcia, taken aback. But Kathleen couldn't contain herself. "Dad's going to New York," she blurted out. Marcia's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how to feel about the news. "New York? What for?" she asked. "He says it's about wheat, but I don't believe him. He told me not to mention it to you," said Kathleen, eager to share what she knew, but also wanting to respect their father's wishes. As they walked back to the house, Marcia tried to contain her curiosity. She quickly changed out of her outdoor clothes and went down to supper. Her father hadn't arrived yet, but Rose was already seated at the table. Finally he came in, boisterous and cheerful. Marcia watched him closely, trying to read any signs of what was going on, but he seemed completely normal, which only made her more suspicious. As they ate, Marcia couldn't help but feel uneasy. She struggled to eat, her stomach churning with anxiety. Finally, her father spoke up. "Marcia, I'd like to see you," he said, rising from the table. For a moment she almost believed that everything was fine, but then Kathleen whispered in her ear, "Don't let him put it over on you now." Her father lit a cigar, a habit of his after supper, but to Marcia it felt like it took an eternity. Something was definitely not right. "Hey, Marcia, I'm heading to New York tonight at 8, and I need you to manage things while I'm gone. I've written down a list of tasks for the guys to do, and you'll need to answer any calls or letters that come in. It's not too much work, but you'll have to stick around in case something important pops up," said her father. "Sure thing, Dad. Why the sudden trip?" asked Marcia. Smith hesitated for a moment before running his hand over the papers on his desk. Did he seem nervous? Mostly wheat deals, I reckon, and maybe a trip to Washington, he replied, puffing on his cigar. Trying to hide her emotions, Marcia asked, "Could you try to find out what happened to Stan Arquette and if he died from his wound?" "Absolutely, Marcia. I promise I'll find out everything you want to know," he replied with enthusiasm. As her father left, Marcia felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She couldn't explain it, but the moment felt significant. In the days that followed, she regained her strength and control over her emotions, knowing that her father would soon provide answers about Stan Arquette. The month of June brought with it a beautiful day filled with golden sunlight and a bright blue sky. Marcia found herself yearning to go out and explore the lush green slopes, but she remained at home waiting anxiously for any news from her father. Every morning the telephone would ring multiple times, but one morning the ring seemed to jolt Marcia with excitement. She answered quickly, and to her delight it was her father on the other end of the line. "Dad, is it you?" cried Marcia, unable to contain her joy. "Sure is, just got here. Are you and the girls okay?" her father replied. "We're doing well, Dad. Oh, but tell me." Marcia trailed off, eager to hear any news about her father. "Wait, I'll be there in 5 minutes," he said before abruptly hanging up. Marcia waited with bated breath for her father's arrival. She searched for her sisters, but remembered they were visiting a friend. She couldn't stand still, and her movements were restless as she constantly checked the porch to see if her father had arrived. Finally, she spotted a car coming down the lane, and she ran inside and out aimlessly until she recognized her father's face. All her fears and anxieties melted away as she saw her father's broad brown face and heard his hearty greeting. He got out of the car with ease despite his heavy build and dismissed the chauffeur. Marcia felt a sense of relief and happiness flood over her as she embraced her father, grateful to have him home once again. Marcia greeted him at the porch steps, sensing his victorious and conclusive aura as she embraced him. "Hey there, you're looking like your old self," he remarked while holding her by the shoulders. "Fantastic, but you've grown into a woman now. Where are the kids?" "They're not here," replied Marcia. "Why are you staring at me like that?" Smith laughed, putting his arm around her as he led her inside. "Anything unusual about your father's handsome face?" His playful tone failed to mask his deep sincerity. Marcia had never felt his strength so acutely. His toughness steadied her nerves, which had started to fray again. Smith took her into his office, closed the door, and threw down his valise. "It feels great to be back," he exclaimed with a heavy breath. Marcia's face turned pale, and that intense shiver within her suddenly stopped. "Tell me straight away," she whispered. He looked at her with blazing eyes, and everything about him changed. "You're a Smith. You can handle a shock?" "Any shock but suspense," she replied. "I lied about the wheat deal and my trip to New York. I received news about Arquette I was afraid to tell you," Smith said. "Yes?" "Arquette is still alive," he continued. Marcia's hands reached out in silent eloquence. "He was severely injured and can't survive," Smith said urgently. "But he's alive. He will live to see you." "Oh, I knew it," Marcia whispered, clasping her hands. "Thank God." "Marcia, calm down. You're starting to shake. Pull yourself together, my girl. Arquette is alive. I brought him home. He's here." "Here?" Marcia screamed. "Yes, he'll be here in half an hour." Marcia fell into her father's arms, unaware and deaf to everything around her. The daylight faded, but her consciousness did not fade. It seemed to her like a magnificent radiance that represented the truth, lost momentarily, blindly groping in whirling darkness. When she regained her senses, she felt like a weak, dizzy, and fluttering child, unable to stand. Marcia's father was in a panic, and he was both coaxing and cursing at the same time. Suddenly, the overwhelming joy that almost caused Marcia to collapse overwhelmed her weakness with incredible strength. She blazed with energy, radiated with excitement, and spoke too quickly to be understood. "Hold on there, girl," interrupted Smith. "You've got the bit in your teeth. Listen, will you? Let me talk." Well, there now. "Sure, it's all right, Marcia. You made me break it sudden-like. Listen, there's all summer to talk. Right now you need to get a few details straight. Arquette is on his way here. They put him on a stretcher that we've been carrying and loaded him onto a motor truck. There's a male nurse who has accompanied me. We should put Arquette in your mother's room." "It's the largest and airiest. You should hurry and open up the windows and make the bed. And don't go out of your mind with happiness. It's more than we ever hoped for to see him alive and bring him home. But he's done for, poor boy. He can't survive. And he's in such bad shape that I don't want you to see him when they bring him in. Do you understand, girl? You'll stay in your room until we call you. Now hurry up." Marcia paced, crouched, and lay in her room, waiting and listening with an intensity that hurt. When a group of men, speaking in hushed tones and walking softly, brought Stan Arquette into the house and up the stairs, Marcia was consumed by a storm of emotions. Compared to what she felt then, all her previous agitation, love, agony, and suspense were nothing. Neither the joy of his survival nor the fear of his impending death had ever charged her heart as much as this terrible desire to see him and understand him. At last a knock on the door and her father's voice. "Marcia, come." Her waiting ordeal was over. Everything else she could handle. That moment ended her weakness. Her blood surged with an irresistible, rejuvenating current of her spirit. Marcia stepped out into the hallway, unlocking the door. Her father was waiting for her, his face no longer etched with worry. "Good, you've got nerve," he said. "You can see him now alone. He's unconscious, but he's not been greatly weakened by the trip. His vitality is wonderful. He comes to once in a while. Sometimes he's rational. Mostly, though, he's out of his head. And his left arm is gone." As they walked down the hall towards the end room, which had not been used since Mrs. Smith's death, her father spoke in a low and rapid voice. Marcia caught the strong scent of antiseptics as they neared the door, which was slightly ajar. Her father knocked softly and called out, "Come out, you men, and let my girl see him." Dr. Lowell, whom Marcia had known for years, tiptoed out, looking important and excited. "Marcia, it's too bad," he said kindly, shaking his head. Another man, Mr. Jarvis the nurse, glided out with the movements of a woman. He was not young, and his aspect was pale and serious. "Marcia, this is Mr. Jarvis the nurse. Now go in and don't forget what I said," her father instructed. Marcia closed the door behind her and leaned back against it, taking in the moment that would change her life forever. Arquette's face, strange yet familiar, appeared against the white background of the bed. It was a supreme moment because it showed him there, alive, justifying the spiritual faith that had persisted in her soul. If she had ever doubted God in moments of distraction, she could never doubt again. The large room was bright, with white curtains softly blowing inward from the open windows. As she crept forward, unsteady on her feet, everything seemed to blur. When she leaned over the still face to kiss it, she could not see clearly. Her lips quivered with that kiss and with her sob of thankfulness. As Marcia knelt beside her lover's bed, she prayed fervently. She felt a subtle shock that seemed to emanate from the stillness of his body. As she touched him, she was grateful for the chance to be close to him, but also terrified of what she might find when she looked at him. The war had taken so much from him, and she didn't know if she could bear to see the damage it had wrought. But as she looked at him, she felt as though a knife had been thrust into her heart. Stan Arquette was no longer the boy she had known before the war. He was a man, with a larger frame and older features that she barely recognized. His face seemed like a mask, unable to hide the pain and sadness that lay beneath. She could see the faint flush of fever and disorder on his skin, and a livid scar that ran from his left temple back as far as she could see. Marcia had expected to find Arquette battered and bruised, but she had not been prepared for the devastation she saw in his face. It was as though the war had stripped away everything that had made him noble and beautiful. She felt an insupportable sadness that seemed to pervade her soul. As she looked at him, she knew that she could never fully understand what he had been through. She could never suffer his ordeal, and that made her heart ache even more. The youth and splendor that had once defined him had been destroyed by the war, and Marcia could only hope that he would find some measure of peace in the years to come. A woman's love is a powerful force, more intuitive and penetrating than anything else. Through this light, Marcia saw a man transformed. He had been through it all, and his hatred had drained away with his blood. His past deeds of terror had left their mark on his face, the shadows under his eyes like blank walls with hidden meanings. Marcia was shaken to her core as she read the record of his murders, the passion that drove him, and the eternal remorse that followed. Despite all this, she couldn't see that he had found God, and she couldn't believe that he was near death. This thought held her transfixed as she gazed down at Arquette, until her father entered and led her away, breaking the spell. Chapter 30. It was nighttime, and Marcia should have been sleeping, but instead she sat up by the window in the dark. Down on the porch, her father was talking animatedly to his men, who were all listening intently. Marcia couldn't resist listening in, even though she knew she shouldn't. She could hear slow, dragging footsteps and the sound of spurs getting closer. "Hey there, boys, come on over and sit down, but keep it down. Here, have some smokes. I'm all wound up and I gotta get this off my chest," Smith said. "Now listen up. We may not know it here, but there's a war going on, and it's happening all the way over in New York. Let me tell you, boys, I never knew how great it was to be American until I went there. New York has got it all, the people, the money, and everything else related to this war. The Liberty Loan Drive was happening, and the streets were packed. The streets were alive with activity and excitement. There were bands and parades, opera stars belting out tunes on street corners, and famous actors selling bonds. Flags, ribbons, and banners hung everywhere, and it seemed every third person was dressed in some sort of uniform. The women were running around like a herd of wild animals. I hopped on one of those high-topped buses with seats and rode down Fifth Avenue. These buses put old stagecoaches to shame. I've ridden in many vehicles in my day, but this was the ride of a lifetime. I couldn't even hear myself think over the music blasting from the speakers, the roar of traffic, and the endless whispers of voices. There were flashes of red, white, and blue, and the shine of 1,000 automobiles down that magnificent street that felt like a canyon. Overhead, a massive cigar-shaped balloon and an airplane buzzed by. These were the first airships I had ever seen. No wonder Jim wanted to. Smith's voice broke, and he paused. The only sounds were the murmurs of running water and the songs of insects. After clearing his throat, he resumed, "I saw 500 Australian soldiers who had just arrived in New York via Panama. They were lean and wiry like Arizona cowboys. They looked fantastic to me. You should have heard the cheering. Roar after roar echoed everywhere they marched along. I also saw United States sailors, Marines, soldiers, and airmen, as well as English officers and Scottish soldiers. The latter caught my eye because they wore funny plaid skirts and had bare legs. 3 of them walked with a limp and had medals. Someone said the Germans called these Scottish soldiers ladies from hell." When I heard that, I had to ask questions and learned that these odd-looking, half-woman-dressed soldiers were simply deadly with cold steel. After hearing that, I looked again and wondered how I hadn't noticed it before. I ought to know men. Then I saw the Blue Devil Frenchmen who had been sent over to help stimulate the Liberty Loan. When I saw them, I couldn't help but take off my hat. I've known a lot of tough, bad, handy, and fighting men in my time, but I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like the Blue Devils. I can't explain it, fellas. Blue Devils is just another name for a French regiment that the Germans had given to the Scots. Any Western man who laid eyes on them would have thought of Wild Bill, Billy the Kid, Geronimo, and Custer all rolled into one, and still they wouldn't have been as fearsome as the Blue Devils. My young friend Arquette, who was dying upstairs, was given a name too. Seems like this war is just like the old days when we used to come up with fitting names for everyone. They called him Demon Arquette, and he got that nickname before he even set foot in France. The boys in his outfit gave it to him because of the way he'd go wild with a bayonet. I don't want my girl Marcia to ever hear about that. A soldier named Owens told me a lot. He was the corporal in Arquette's outfit, sort of like a foreman, I suppose. He saw Arquette every day for the months they were in the service, and the shell that got Arquette made Owens a cripple. This Owens fella said that Arquette didn't really get close to his bunkmates until they got to France. Then he started to have an influence over them. Owens didn't know how he did it. In fact, he never really knew until the outfit got to the front lines somewhere in northern France. They spent days in the first line, right up close to the Germans, watching and sneaking all the time, shooting and dodging. But they never really had a true fight. That is, until one morning when the Germans charged them in overwhelming numbers. That's when it all went down. Wow, I sure wish I could remember how Owens told that story. You guys have never heard about a real fight until you've been in a war like this. Let me tell you some of the things that happened during the German charge. I'll try to remember them all as they come to me. There was a boy named Griggs who ran through the German barrage 7 times to fetch ammunition for his fellow soldiers. Another boy was blown off the road twice by exploding shells while on the same mission, but he still went back. Owens told us about 2 guys from his company who rushed a group of Germans, killed 8 of them, and captured their machine gun. Before the German charge, a big shell came over and kicked up a hill of mud. The next day the Americans found their sentinel buried in that mud, dead at his post with his bayonet presented. Owens was shot as he jumped up with his comrades to meet the charging Germans. He fell and dragged himself against a wall of bags where he watched the fight unfold. He happened to be facing Arquette's squad, which was attacked by 3 times their number. Owens saw Arquette get shot and go down, but then he got back up with blood all over one side of his face. Dixon, a college football player, rushed a German who was about to throw a bomb. Dixon got the German and the bomb, which exploded. Little Rogers, an Irish boy, fought 3 Germans and killed one before he was bayoneted in the back. Then Arquette, the demon they'd named him, went on a rampage. He had a unique way with a bayonet, according to Owens. Arquette was heavy, powerful, and fast. He lifted and slung 2 Germans, one after another, as quickly as you'd toss a couple of wheat sheafs with your pitchfork. Blood squirted everywhere as the Germans rolled away. And then 4 more Germans were shooting at him. Right into their teeth Arquette ran, laughing wildly and terribly, Owens said. The Germans couldn't stop the flashing bayonet. Arquette ripped them all open, and before they stopped flopping, he was on the bunch that had killed Brewer and were making it hard for his other partners. Woo! Owens told it all as if it took lots of time, but that fight was like lightning, and I can't remember how it was. Only Demon Arquette laid out 9 Germans before they retreated. 9. Owens saw him do it like a mad bull loose. Then the shell came over that put Arquette out, and Owens too. Well, Arquette had a mangled arm and many wounds. They amputated his arm in France, patched him up, and sent him back to New York with a lot of other wounded soldiers. They expected him to die long ago, but he hangs on. He's full of lead now. What a hell of a lot of killing some men take. My boy Jim would have been like that. So there, folks, you have a little bit of American fighting come home to you, straight and true. I say that's what the Germans have roused. Well, it was a bad day for them when they figured everything on paper, had it all cut and dried, but failed to see the spirit of men. Marcia tore herself away from the window so that she could not hear any more, and in the darkness of her room she began to pace to and fro, beginning to undress for bed, shaking in some kind of a frenzy, scarcely knowing what she was about until sundry knocks from furniture and the falling over a chair awakened her to the fact that she was in a tumult. "What am I doing?" she panted in bewilderment, reaching out in the dark to turn on the light. Like awakening from a nightmare, she saw the bright light flash up. It changed her feeling. As Marcia gazed at her reflection in the mirror, she was almost stunned by the person staring back at her. Who was she? Her hair was wild and fell over her bare shoulders. Her face was pale with red spots on her cheeks. Her eyes blazed like balls of fire. Her lips were curled in a passionate, savage manner, and her bare chest heaved with a tumultuous heart. As she took in her appearance, she felt an inexplicable passion that made her feel as intense as steel and as hot as fire. Her blood pulsed through her body, and she was a victim to irrepressible thrills that rushed through her from the soles of her feet to the roots of her hair. It was glorious, terrible, and furious all at once. As the storm slowly subsided, she turned out the light and fell onto the bed. She thought, wondered, and whispered to herself about what had just happened. The tale of Arquette's tragedy had stirred something deep within her. It had awakened the primitive, hidden, and unplumbed parts of her that she didn't even know existed. She had looked at herself in the mirror and saw 2 selves, the white-skinned, fair-haired girl that civilization had produced, and the blazing, panting, savage woman of the bygone ages. She couldn't escape from either. The story of Demon Arquette's terrible fight had retrograded her to the female of the species, more savage and dangerous than the male. She couldn't lie to herself. She had gloried in his prowess. He was her man, gone out with a club to beat down the brutes that would steal her from him. Alas, what are we? What am I? She whispered to herself. Do I even know myself? What could I not have done a moment ago? She had that primitive thing in her, and though she shuddered to realize it, she had no regret. Life was life. That Arquette had laid low so many enemies was grand to her and righteous, since these enemies were like cavemen come for prey. The rush of fear and excitement still coursed through her veins. Demon Arquette, what a man! She knew exactly what he would do and how it would affect him spiritually. Her womanly side reveled in his fight while her soul recoiled at the implications. The only hope for any man or woman was in God. These men, like her father, Jake, Arquette, and his comrades, were so basic, natural, and inevitable. They loved to fight, sometimes even hated it, but they loved it most. Men's lives were filled with strife, and their greatness shone through in war. War brought out the best and worst in people. Wounds, blood, pain, and death were nothing to those who fought for the liberation of something unproven within themselves. Life was fleeting, and the secret must lie beyond. Men could not act that way for nothing. There must be some hidden purpose through the ages. Smith had called in a world-renowned specialist to examine Stan Arquette. Marcia had not been present during the examination, but she was in her father's study when the report was given. To her, the little man was all intellect, science, and electricity. He stated that Arquette had over 25 wounds, some serious, most trivial, and combined not necessarily fatal. Many soldiers with worse wounds had fully recovered. Arquette's vitality and strength had been so remarkable that great loss of blood and almost complete lack of nourishment had not brought about his present condition. "He will die, and that is best for him," said the specialist. "His case is not extraordinary. I saw many like it in France during the first year of the war when I was there. But I will say that he must have been both physically and mentally above the average before he went to fight." During my examination, I witnessed his periods of unconsciousness and delirium. However, there was a brief moment when he regained consciousness and seemed sane. The nurse informed me that this had happened a few times in the past 2 days, but unfortunately it offered no hope. The reason being that an intense and prolonged emotion had caused damage to his kinetic organs, resulting in the destruction of brain cells that could not be replaced. Even if he were to survive, he would be permanently impaired, possibly becoming neurasthenic, melancholic, insane, or all three. It was a tragic situation, as he had been a promising young man. Nevertheless, it was ultimately for the best that he would pass away. The scientist who examined him explained the biological case of Stan Arquette, leaving Smith with no hope. He was devastated and could not comprehend the situation, though he had no choice but to accept it. He cursed his luck and the specialist, claiming that he had known Indian medicine men who were better. Marcia, Smith's daughter, understood her father's frustration and thought she understood the scientist. To her, Smith was just human, and the scientist was a wealth of knowledge, but they both lacked something that she felt in herself. She went out alone into the dark night to look up at the stars beyond the wheat slope, feeling a mysterious harmony with the universe. She believed that science had its place in progress, but hated how it disregarded the soul. Her spirit was filled with strength and trust, and the tangible things of the universe around her were voices that spoke to her. "Look up to the hills from where your help comes." The day after the specialist's visit, Arquette surprised the family doctor, the nurse, Smith, and everyone except Marcia by waking up from a spell of unconsciousness, which seemed to lift the shadow of death, at least for the time being. Kathleen was the first to burst into Marcia's room with the incredible news. Marcia could only gasp in excitement and sit trembling with her hands over her heart while the child babbled. "I listened and I peeped in," Kathleen repeated. "Stan was awake. He spoke, but very softly. He knows he's at many waters. I heard him say, 'Marcia. Oh, I'm so happy, Marcia, that before he dies he'll know you talked to him.'" "Hush, child," whispered Marcia. "Stan's not going to die." "But they all say so. That funny little doctor yesterday made me tired, but he said so. I heard him as Dad put him into the car." "Yes, Kathy, I heard him too, but I don't believe it," replied Marcia dreamily. "Stan doesn't look so sick. Only I don't know what's different, I guess. I'm crazy to go in and see him. Marcia, will they ever let me?" Their father's abrupt entrance interrupted the conversation. He was pale and forceful, as if something was at stake, but undecided. "Kathy, go out," he said. Marcia rose to face him. "My girl Arquette's come, and he's asked for you. I was for letting him see you, but Lowell and Jarvis say no, not yet. Now he might die any minute. Seems to me he ought to see you. It's right, and if you say so—" "Yes," replied Marcia. "By heaven, he shall see you then," said Smith, breathing hard. "I'm justified, even if it—" He didn't finish his significant speech, but left her abruptly. Presently, Marcia was summoned. As she left her room, she was consumed by an uncontrollable sense of agitation. She fought against it as she made her way down the long hallway, finally pausing at Arquette's half-open door to lean against the wall. She took a moment to calm her nerves, praying for the wisdom to make her presence and her words a source of infinite good in this crisis. She couldn't recall how she made it to Arquette's bedside, but there she was, detached from herself and locked in a state of serene emotion. "Marcia," he said, his voice distant but filled with gladness. "Welcome home, my soldier boy," she replied, bending down to kiss his cheek and lay her own beside it. "I never hoped to see you again," he said. "Oh, but I knew," murmured Marcia, lifting her head. Arquette's right hand, brown, bare, and rough, lay outside the coverlet upon his breast, weakly reaching for her. Marcia took it in both of hers, gazing steadily into his eyes. She saw him comparing the image he had limned upon his memory with her face. "Changed, you're older, more beautiful yet the same," he said. "It seems long ago." "Yes, long ago. Indeed, I am older. But all's well that ends well. You are back." "Marcia, haven't you been told I can't live?" "Yes, but it's untrue," she replied, projecting all the conviction of her soul and faith into that single word and serene smile, all that was love and woman in her opposing death. A subtle, indefinable change came over Arquette. "Marcia, I paid for my father," he whispered. "I killed Hans. I spilled the blood in me I hated." "But everything was wrong, so wrong," she exclaimed, her voice piercing. "But it wasn't your fault," she quickly added. "You were just doing your duty as an American soldier, and you were magnificent. But now your duty in that regard is done. A higher duty awaits you." His eyes filled with sadness and wonder as he silently questioned her. "You must become the great sower of wheat," she declared. "Sower of wheat," he whispered, the light of understanding suddenly illuminating his questioning gaze. "There will be millions starving after this war. Wheat is the staff of life. I must get well. I must." She hesitated before sinking to her knees beside his bed. "Stan, when you're able to sit up, I'll marry you. Then I'll take you home to your wheat fields." For a moment Marcia saw him transformed by her spirit, faith, and love. This was what she had prayed for, to carry him beyond hopelessness and incredulity. It was as though some divine guidance had prompted her, and when he suddenly lost consciousness she had no fear. In her own room she let her emotions surge and struggle until relief and calmness returned to her. Then she felt a great and beautiful exaltation. Marcia knew that she had been gifted with incalculable power. She had pierced Arquette's fatalistic consciousness with the truth and glory of possible life, as opposed to the dark and evil morbidity of war. She saw for herself the wonderful and terrible stairs of sand which women had been climbing all the ages, and must climb onto the heights of solid rock, of equality, of salvation for the human race. She observed the woman, the primal female of the species, but she also saw her as the mother of the species, created to both preserve and propagate life. Through the agony of childbirth and child-rearing she learned the significance of the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." The resistance of women against the brutality of men would be immense. Women were destined to be humanity's saviors. It appeared so natural and straightforward that it couldn't be any other way. Marcia understood with a unique realization of its magnificence that when most women had discovered their purpose in life, as she had, it would put an end to violence, greed, hatred, war, and the dismal and grotesque imperfection of mankind. Marcia opposed the theory of scientists and biologists with all her intellect and passion. If they proved that strife and conflict were necessary for human development, that without violence, bloodshed, and endless strife the race would deteriorate, then she would say that it would be preferable to deteriorate and die. Women would all object to that, and they would never believe it. She would never believe it with her heart. But if her intellect was compelled to accept certain theories, she had to find a way to reconcile life with the inscrutable designs of nature. The theory that perpetual strife was the very essence of plants, birds, beasts, and men appeared to be confirmed by every current reaction. But if these were fixed materialistic laws of the existence of animated forms on the earth, then what was God? What was the driving force in Stan Arquette that made war duty a type of murder that overpowered his mind? What was the love in her heart for all living things and the nameless sublime faith in her soul? Marcia spoke up, her words sounding like a prayer. "If we have to fight, let women fight against violence and men fight their destructive instincts forever." From that moment, Stan Arquette's condition improved. Dr. Lowell acknowledged that Marcia was the only medicine that could save him from the death that everyone else had deemed as inevitable. Marcia was allowed to see him for a few minutes every day, but only when he was coherent and free from pain. She had no idea what his condition was like the rest of the time, but she started to suspect that it was dire. "Dad, I'm going to stay with Stan for as long as I want," Marcia declared one day. This worried Smith, and he struggled to find the right words. "I promised Stan that I'd marry him on the day he could sit up," Marcia continued. "And I believe he will get better sooner if I'm with him more. He loves me, and I feel like I'm the only thing that can save him from madness and death." Smith was taken aback. "I believe you. It takes a woman to see things clearly. What's your plan?" "I want to marry him," Marcia murmured. "I want to nurse him back to health and take him home to his wheat fields." Smith paced the floor, considering the idea. "It can't hurt to try. It might even save him. And you'll be his wife, even if it's only for a little while. By George, let's do it. You've never led me astray before." "Girl, it's going to be tough for you to see him when he's having those spells," said Marcia's friend. "Spells?" echoed Marcia. "Yes, you were told that he goes crazy, but you didn't know how. It's even nerve-wracking for me. It's fascinating to watch, but I couldn't handle seeing his face when his memories come back to him." "Memories?" asked Marcia, shuddering. "Those memories of the Huns he killed come back to him. He fights them, going through strange motions as if his left arm wasn't gone. He uses his right arm and makes the same movements he made when he killed those Huns with his bayonet. It's terrible to witness, especially the look on his face. I heard that in France they even photographed him during one of these spells. I wouldn't want you to see him like that, but maybe after Dr. Lowell explains it, you'll understand." Poor guy. It must be awful for him to relive it all over again. But once he's better, with his wheat fields and me to fill his mind, those spells will disappear. Maybe, I hope so. It's all beyond me, but you're going to get your way." Dr. Lowell then explained to Marcia that Arquette, like all mentally unstable soldiers, only dreamed and raved about one thing when he was asleep or out of his mind: the enemy. In his nightmares, Arquette had to be restrained. The doctor explained that the encouraging sign of Arquette's condition was a gradual daily improvement in his strength and a decrease in the length and intensity of his spells. This news made Marcia happy. She even relieved the exhausted nurse during the day and prepared herself for the first encounter with Arquette's unique madness. Arquette couldn't sleep while Marcia was around, and he watched her for hours on end. He had been staying at Many Waters for 10 days, and she had yet to see what she feared. However, during his stay, he noticeably improved. One afternoon, Smith brought a minister, and in a short time, Marcia became Arquette's wife. Chapter 31. Something remarkable happened. The minister had just left when Stan Arquette's beaming joy and happiness were shattered, as if he had been turned from man to beast, his face contorted, resembling that of a gorilla. He rose up, forcefully sweeping his right arm outward with a strange twisting motion. It was like a bayonet thrust, and he still had his left arm intact. A fierce, incomprehensible battle cry escaped his lips, unmistakably German. Marcia stood frozen in place while her father, grinding his teeth, tried to lead her away. Arquette was about to fall off the bed when Marcia let out a piercing cry and ran to catch him, forcing him back onto the bed. She held him tightly, suppressing his struggles, calling out with an intensity that seemed to penetrate even his delirium. Whatever effect she had on him, it calmed him down, and his savage expression softened until he lay back, passive and pale. It was clear when his reason returned, for he gazed fixedly at Marcia. "I had one of my fits," he said hoarsely. "Oh, I don't know what it was," replied Marcia, her voice trembling. Her strength was beginning to ebb away, and her arms, which had held him so tightly, were slipping away. "Son, you had a bad spell," interjected Smith, breathing heavily. "It's the first one she's seen." "Marcia, I took down my Huns again," Arquette said with a tragic smile. "Lately I've been able to sense when they were coming back." "Did you know just now?" asked Marcia. "I think so. I wasn't completely out of my mind. I've known when I did that." The memories were overwhelming, but action helped push them away. He felt the urge to kill his enemies all over again. Marcia looked at him with deep love and sadness. "Do you remember when we got married?" she asked. "My wife," he whispered. "Husband. I knew you were coming home to me. I knew you wouldn't die. I know you'll get better. I'm starting to feel that too. Maybe the dark thoughts will go away," he said. "They have to, or you'll lose me," Marcia said, her voice trembling. If you keep reliving those moments, it'll be me who dies." As Marcia went to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that Arquette was affected by her words. She wasn't sure if he was scared or determined, but something had changed. She had mentioned his phantoms returning, and she could tell it had weakened him. But what Marcia's father and Arquette didn't know was that once she was alone, Marcia broke down in fear. She couldn't bear the thought of Arquette turning into a gorilla and reliving the savage killings he had performed. It was too much for her. Despite her fear, Marcia stayed by Arquette's side, watching over him day and night. She saw him slowly improve, but the fear of his madness returning never left her. She waited for it, dreading the moment it would consume him again. But it never did. If Marcia had to stay up with Arquette at night, she never mentioned it. However, after a week, Arquette's condition improved, and Marcia felt less stressed. A little while later, they no longer needed the nurse, but Marcia was nervous about being alone with Arquette at night. She slept on a couch in his room, but didn't close her eyes. Arquette slept, but he had both peaceful and restless moments. He talked and moaned in his sleep, and once he even seemed to be having a nightmare, but Marcia woke him up. The next day he felt better and was hungry. Marcia was relieved. One beautiful June morning, Smith entered Arquette's room and said, "Well, son, let's talk wheat." Arquette sighed and looked at his empty sleeve, saying, "How can I even do a man's work again in the fields?" Marcia reassured him, saying, "You will sow more wheat than ever and harvest more, too." Smith agreed. "I should smile, but how? I've only one arm." Marcia replied, "Stan, you hug me better with that one arm than you ever did with two arms." Smith laughed and said, "Son, you lose that argument. Me and Marcia stand pat. You'll sow more and better wheat than any other man in the Northwest. Get my hunch? Well, I'll tell you later." Smith then spoke seriously to Arquette. "Now see here, let me declare myself about you. I see it worries you more and more now you're getting well. You miss that good arm, and you feel the pain of bullets that still lodge somewhere in you, and you think you'll be a cripple always. Look things in the face square. Sure, compared to what you once were, you'll be a cripple. But Stan Arquette weighing 190 let loose on a bunch of Huns was some man. My God. Forget that, and forget that you'll never chop a cord of wood again in a day. Look, we gave you up, but now you're with us and doing well. If you work hard, you'll be able to do some tough jobs in the future. This is great news for Marcia and me. Listen to this." Smith opened up a newspaper and started to read. The winter wheat states are experiencing continued improvement along with favorable weather conditions. This has led to an increase in crop estimates made 2 weeks ago, which were mainly based on the government's report. It's likely that the yield from winter fields will exceed 600 million bushels. Additionally, the spring states have unexpectedly seen a large increase in acreage. For example, Minnesota's food administrator has reported a 40% addition in his state instead of the expected 20%. Plants throughout the spring area have a good start and are in excellent condition. It's possible that the yield will rise to 300 million bushels, making a total of about 900 million. In normal times, 280 million could be exported, and through conservation, the surplus could be easily increased to 350 million or even 400 million. Estimates of acreage increase in Canada were also too low. Alberta's addition was reported to be 20%, but recent reports make it 40%. Canada may harvest a crop of 300 million bushels, which is nearly 70 million more than last year's. Our allies in Europe will be able to rely on the shipment of 500 million bushels from the United States and Canada. After the coming harvest, there will be an ample supply of wheat for Germany's enemies at ports that can be easily reached. Additionally, large surplus stocks in Australia and Argentina will be available once ships can be spared for such service. And the ships are coming from the builders. Marcia eagerly watched her husband's face as they discussed the wheat supply. The war had never been mentioned before, so she was anxious to hear his response. "Great!" he exclaimed with a glow on his cheeks. "Wheat for the Allies and neutrals for more than a year. Smith, the United States will feed and save the world." Smith continued to list the accomplishments of America in the war effort. "We're sending thousands of soldiers a day, ships are being built fast, airplanes are coming like a swarm of bees, and the government has money to burn. Every American is getting mad. Arquette, the Germans don't know they're ruined. What do you say?" Arquette looked strange and asked for Marcia's help to stand up. She was both fascinated and frightened as she assisted him. He revealed that he had killed Germans in the war, even though he had not wanted to fight. He had been shell-shocked, shocked, gassed, and bayoneted. Arquette had taken 25 wounds before a shell took him down. He had seen his comrades kill and be killed before him. To him, this was the American way. Their enemies were driven, blinded, stolid, brutal, obsessed, and desperate. They were German, lacking not strength nor efficiency nor courage but soul. White and spent, Arquette leaned upon Marcia and got back into his bed. Smith responded with excitement, which he tried to conceal. "I get your hunch," he said. "Well, if I needed any assurance, you just gave it to me. To hell with the Germans. Let's not talk about them anymore," exclaimed the rancher. "Now back to business. Wheat. Son, I have plans that will blow your mind. We will harvest a bumper crop at Many Waters in July, and we will sow 2,000 acres of winter wheat. That's just the beginning. This summer I got mad and went on a buying spree. I bought up almost all the farms around yours up in the Bend country. There's a big harvest of spring wheat coming, and you'll be supervising that harvest while I take care of ours here. And you'll be sowing 10,000 acres of fallow on your own rich hills this fall. Do you understand what I'm saying? 10,000 acres. "Smith," gasped Arquette. "Yes, Smith," mimicked the rancher. "My blood's up, but I wouldn't feel this good about it if you hadn't come back. The land isn't all paid for, but it's ours. We'll meet our notes. I've been up there twice this spring. You'd never know a few hills had burned over last harvest. Olson and your other neighbors, or most of them, will work the land on half shares, and you'll be the boss. And come fall, you'll be the biggest sower of wheat in the Northwest." "My sower of wheat," murmured Marcia, tears streaming down her face. "Dreams are coming true," he said softly. "Marcia, after I saw you the second time and fell so in love with you, I had vain dreams of you. But even my wildest never pictured you as the wife of a wheat farmer. I never dreamed you loved wheat." "But I do," replied Marcia. "Why, when I was born, Dad bought Many Waters and sowed the slopes in wheat. I remember how he used to take me up to the fields all green or golden. I've grown up with wheat. I'd never want to live anywhere away from it." "Listen to me. One day I'll tell you all about the history and romance of wheat," said Arquette, with a look of pride and wonder in his eyes. "Save it for later," interjected Smith. "Son, would it surprise you if I told you I've changed my mind a bit about the IODW?" "No," replied Arquette. "Well, things happen. What made me think hard was the way that government man got results from the IOW in the lumber country. You see, the government needed a lot of timber for ships and spruce for airplanes. They needed it fast. Most of the lumbermen and loggers were IWW or belonged to it. Last summer, all the striking lumbermen belonged to the IWW. These guys believed that the workers and their employers had nothing in common under the capitalistic order of labor and that the government was in cahoots with capital. This government official went up there and convinced the IWW that their best interests were the same as the government's. He got them to work, and the government got the lumber. He was fair with them. He paid those who were honest and considered their needs. He punished those who were crooked according to their wrongdoing, and the innocent didn't have to suffer with the guilty. That deal showed me how many of the IWW could be handled, and we have to deal with the IWW. Most of the farmhands in the country belong to it. This summer I'll give the square harvesters what they want, and that's a big change for me. But I won't tolerate any nonsense from disgruntled disorganizers. If men want to work, they'll have work and they'll be paid well. You'll follow this plan up in the Bend country. We'll meet this labor union halfway. After the war, there may be trouble between labor and capital. As I see it, hard-working men deserve to share in the profits. If that doesn't resolve the issue, then we may be dealing with an organization led by socialists and anarchists. If that's the case, we'll have to resort to the measures we used last summer, which I'm not proud of," said Smith. Arquette responded, "You're right, Smith. There was trouble here last summer. Did you ever find evidence that German money supported the IWW to strike and embarrass our government?" "No, but I believe it to be true. Otherwise, the IWW leaders took advantage of a critical time. I have to say, though, that now thousands of IWW workers are loyal to the United States, and that made me change my mind." "I'll handle them the same way," Arquette said passionately. Then Marcia interrupted their conversation and convinced her father to leave the room, as he was exhausted. Over the next few days, Marcia spent her time happily packing what she wanted to bring to Arquette's home. She had set a date but wanted to surprise him with the news. Smith had agreed to accompany them, and he said, "I'll take the girls. It'll be a great ride for them. We'll stay overnight in the village and come back home the next day. Marcia, I just realized something. You're leaving. What will happen to me?" All of a sudden, Smith showed the effects of the pain and loss he had experienced over the past year. Marcia hugged him and felt her heart fill with emotion. "Dad, I'm not leaving you," she reassured him. "You'll get better up there, find your balance among those desert wheat hills. We'll split our time between the two places. Remember, you can come up here any day. Your interests are there now. Dad, don't think of it as separation." "Our family has taken in Stan and will be away from time to time," Marcia said with a smile, trying to lighten his worn face. "We all have our weaknesses," he responded thoughtfully. "Mine is the fear of getting old and being alone. It's selfish, but I've lived, and I don't think I have much more to ask for." Marcia couldn't help but feel a tinge of sadness amidst her growing happiness. Joy for some brings gloom to others. Life is a mix of sunshine and storm, youth and age. This morning Marcia found Kathleen entertaining Arquette for the second time. The child was still in awe of him and had become quite the hero worshipper. Marcia had forbidden Kathleen from asking Arquette about anything regarding the war, but it was clear that he had already told her things. Kathleen was white, wide-eyed, and beautiful, with all her imagination stirred. "I've been telling Kathy how I lost my arm," explained Arquette. "I hate Germans, I hate war," cried Kathleen passionately. "My dear, hate them always," said Arquette. After Kathleen had left, Marcia questioned Arquette about whether it was right to tell the child to always hate Germans. "Right!" exclaimed Arquette with a strange laugh. Every day he showed signs of a stronger personality. "Marcia, what I went through has confused my sense of right and wrong. Maybe someday it will all become clear. But Marcia, I will hate Germans for the rest of my life, even if I live to be 90. "Oh, Stan, it's too soon for you to be less narrow-minded and less passionate," Marcia replied hesitantly. "I understand. In the future, people will not judge others based on their government or military class, or so the conversation went." Arquette, however, disagreed. He believed that those in their country were too far removed from reality to understand the horrors of war. Having spent 6 months in France, he had seen firsthand the destroyed villages and thousands of refugees. He had even met the enemy, the Huns, at the front. To truly comprehend the situation, one had to go over there and witness it for themselves. Arquette admitted that he himself would be an emotionally burnt-out man if it weren't for his love, Marcia. She had given him a reason to keep going. Nevertheless, he would hate Germans for the rest of his life and beyond. He told her of a French regiment called the Blue Devils, who had experienced unspeakable atrocities at the hands of the Huns. One soldier had found his own mother disemboweled, his wife violated and murdered, his sister left maimed, his daughter carried off, and his son crippled for life. These were not just stories, these were cold, hard facts. Marcia was horrified and asked if there was any hope. Arquette assured her that hate did not mean all was lost. He shared a story of his last fight in which he unknowingly faced a young boy. In that moment he realized that the boy was just like any other young man, full of hopes and dreams. War had robbed him of his future. It was a sobering realization for Arquette, and he hoped that others could see the humanity in their enemies as well. All I could see was his body, his blade clashing with mine. His weapon felt like a child's toy in my hands as I swept it aside and lunged. He screamed, "Kamerad!" before my blade reached him. But it was too late. I ran him through, and then I looked at him. He was just a boy of 19, and he never should have been forced to meet me. It was murder. I watched him die on my bayonet. I saw him slide off of it and stretch out. At that moment I didn't hate him. I would have given my life for his. I hated what he represented. That moment was the end of me as a soldier. If I hadn't been in range of the exploding shell that downed me, I would have dropped my rifle and stood strengthless before the next Hun. So, you see, even though I killed them, and even though I hate them now, there's something inexplicable and strange. "That something is the divine in you. It is God," cried Marcia. Arquette somberly shook his head. "God? I didn't find God out there. I can't see God's hand in this infernal war. But I can." "What called you so resistlessly? What made you go?" asked Marcia. "You know, the debt I thought I ought to pay, and duty to my country." And then when the debt was paid, the duty fulfilled, when you stood stricken at the sight of that poor boy dying on your bayonet, what happened in your soul? Marcia asked. I don't know, but I saw the wrong of war, the wrong to him, the wrong to me. I thought of no one else, certainly not of God, replied Arquette. If you had stayed your bayonet, if you had spared that boy, as you would have done had you seen or heard him in time, what would that have been? Asked Marcia. Pity, maybe, or scorn to slay a weaker foe, replied Arquette. No, 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 I can't accept that, cried Marcia passionately. Do you see beyond what's in front of you? Asked Marcia. I see that men will always fight and war will never end. I learned this out there, replied Stan. If there's goodness in you, then there's goodness in every man. Eventually, this will bring an end to war. Men just need to be taught right. Education and religion can bring peace on earth and goodwill to man, said Marcia. No, that's not true. We've tried educating and teaching religion, but war still happens. The truth is that life is a fight. Civilization only goes skin deep. Underneath it all, man is still a savage. He still wants what he needed when he lived in a primitive state. War isn't necessary to show how every man fights for food, clothing, and shelter. Today we call it competition in business. Even children fight in their games. It must be that some kind of strife was implanted in humans from the beginning, and it's necessary for life, replied Stan. Survival of the fittest, exclaimed Marcia bitterly. Stan, we've changed. You represent the physical and I represent the spiritual. We need to find harmony with each other. We can't ever hope to learn the truth of life. There's something beyond us, something infinite which I believe is God. My soul finds it in you. The war has left you physically and mentally impaired, but these will pass. Please don't accept absolute acceptance of evolution and materialism. They are realities, but they cannot be denied. As I gaze out beyond the present, I can see the greater purpose that has been running through the ages. In our time, the Germans have risen to power, and their brutal tactics have caused many to believe that civilization is at a standstill and idealism is dead. However, this is only a temporary situation. We will emerge from this dark time as better, wiser, and more refined individuals. The history of the world is proof of the slow but steady growth and perfection of humanity. While perfection may never be fully attained, the growth we experience along the way is a beautiful and divine thing. It is not a hopeless prospect, but rather an inspiring one. Life is a mystery, and it can often feel futile when we think about it without faith. As the poet says, we are on a dark plain where ignorant armies clash by night. However, I believe that there is something within women, an instinct of creation and motherhood, that allows us to feel what cannot be expressed. It is the hope of the world. Arquette interrupted my thoughts, bursting out with his own fears and doubts. He spoke of war and the possibility of his future son being killed, just as he had killed another young man. How could he reconcile the sense of God and the great purpose of the ages that I spoke of with the horrors of war and death? My heart ached for Arquette, but I knew that there was hope for him yet. I spoke of our future son, and how we would teach him the meaning of life and the truth of immortality. Our son would be taught what all future sons must learn in order to prevent war from happening again. The growth and improvement of humanity is enough for faith, and it will lead us to a brighter future. Arquette asked how this would prevent war, and I replied that it would prevent it in the years to come. We may not see the end of war in our lifetime, but we can work towards a better future for our children and their children. The hope of the world lies within the mothers who create and nurture life, and it is up to us to teach our children the meaning of life and the importance of peace. Mothers have the responsibility to ensure that their children learn the consequences of war from a young age. Boys may view war as an opportunity for glory, medals, and the thrill of charging into battle, but mothers see it as a source of grief and pain. Boys must understand the difference between their eagerness to fight and the horror they will feel when they see the victims of war. The statues of great generals may symbolize glory and honor, but they represent countless graves of forgotten soldiers. The joy of the conquering army is in stark contrast to the suffering, poverty, and hatred of the conquered. Arquette understood the message, but believed it would make his son a weak soldier. He worried that his son would fall prey to the sons of fathers who had not taught them the same lessons. He wanted his son to be a strong and brave fighter, not an inferior man. Marcia disagreed, saying that teaching children the wrongs of violence would make them better men. However, Arquette saw the masculine attitude as inevitable, with blood and energy overpowering higher motives. Marcia felt like a weak woman standing against all of mankind, but she refused to give up hope. She believed that men could change and that one day they would all teach their sons the same lesson. Arquette admitted that he had changed, but Marcia knew that changing all men would be a monumental task. "I don't know myself," Marcia whispered softly to her husband. "If we do have a son, will you let me teach him what I think is right?" "Marcia, of course I will," he exclaimed. "I try to understand your perspective, but if I can't, I'll never oppose you. Teach me if you can." She kissed him and knelt beside his bed, saddened to see the shadow return to his face, yet thrilled that she had the opportunity to inspire him. However, she knew she must never again bring up war, materialism, or anything that would cause him to delve into the darkness of his soul and contemplate the damage to his mind. She remembered the specialist talking about lesions in the organic system and the loss of brain cells. Her inspiration must be love, charm, and care, a healing and building process. She would give herself fully with all the unutterable and immeasurable love in her heart. She would order her life to fulfill his education, his heritage, his passion, and his noble work. Surely he could be saved through the cultivation of wheat. "Do you love me?" she whispered. "Do I? Nothing could ever change my love for you," he replied. "I am your wife, you know." The shadow left his face. "Are you, really? Marcia Smith?" "Marcia Arquette. It's a beautiful name now." "It does sound sweet, but you, my wife, I can't believe it." "You'll have to very soon." "Why?" A light, warm and glad and marveling shone in his eyes. Marcia felt a break in his strange aloofness and his impersonal, gentle acceptance of her relation to him. "Tomorrow I'm taking you home to your wheat hills." Chapter 32. Marcia shared her interpretation of the history and romanticism surrounding wheat with Arquette during a pivotal moment where it was crucial to inspire hope and positivity for the future. At the dawn of civilization, survival depended on finding food. Foraging in forests and fields, early humans were forced to eat bark, plants, and berries to avoid starvation. But one day a meat-eating savage stumbled upon a stalk of grain that satisfied his hunger in a way he had never experienced before. This accidental discovery may have led to the cultivation of wheat. Although the identity of the first wheat growers is lost to history, they must have been among the earliest humans. Wheat eventually became a staple food, ground into flour and baked into bread. For countless centuries, bread sustained and nourished people. The origin of wheat is shrouded in mystery. An ancient Chaldean priest once tried to determine if wheat grew wild, but the question was never resolved. Despite this uncertainty, it is generally believed that wheat cultivation required human intervention. Wheat growers had to stay in one place to till and sow their fields, so wandering tribes could not cultivate crops. The story of wheat's origin became a legend in many cultures, and mythology included tales of wheat gods favoring certain peoples. China grew wheat 27 centuries before Bert, and prehistoric ruins have yielded grains of wheat. The fertile Nile Valley was a natural place to grow wheat, and it became a major crop in ancient Egypt. The Arabs rode on their camels from the desert to the land of plenty, and Rebekah gazed across the golden fields toward the mysterious east as she filled her earthen pitcher at the palm-shaded well. As Moses watched over his flock in the Arabian desert, he caught a whiff of wheat carried by the wind. The Bible spoke of the finest wheat filling the borders of peace. But the days of the Middle Ages were marked by black bread and impure flour, leading to the oppression of peasants and the wealth of landowners. These were days of toil, poverty, war, blight, drought, and famine. The common man cried out for bread or blood. However, with the spread of wheat came a higher civilization. Wheat fields surrounded prosperous farmers' homes, happy peoples toiled fruitfully, and millers worked their humming mills. When wheat crossed the ocean to America, it fulfilled its destiny in strange and wonderful ways. The country was fresh, vast, and free, with pioneers spreading the golden grain westward. Railroad lines kept pace with the indomitable wheat sowers, and unprecedented harvests yielded records to each succeeding year. Machines were used to till, plant, and harvest boundless fields. Enormous flour mills hummed and whirred, grinding daily 10,000 barrels of flour. The steel rolls poured out a white stream of pure, clean, and sweet flour. the whitest and finest in the world. In 1918, America became the salvation of starving Belgium, the mainstay of England, and the hope of France. Wheat was food, strength, and fighting life for the armies opposing the hideous horde of Huns. America rose from its peaceful slumber to a mighty wrath, throwing its vast resources of soil and endless streams of wheat into the gulf of war. It was an exalted destiny for a people. The truth of the matter was a blatant challenge to the old-fashioned ways of authority. The fields, the labor, and the grains of wheat were the foundation of humanity. They represented freedom and sustenance for the entire globe. 2 cars ascended the sloping valley, making their way towards a seemingly desolate green land, high above the shimmering river. The day was filled with warm, fragrant winds blowing from the west, and the rich, thick amber light of June. As they arrived at a particular spot on the road, Smith stopped his car and waited for the other car carrying Marcia and Arquette. Marcia's delight was evident on her face as she enjoyed the ride. Arquette lay comfortably on an improvised couch next to her. He looked out across the treeless land, his eyes holding the gaze of a returned soldier who never thought he would see his homeland again. Marcia watched him with a heart full of emotion, sensing every nuance of his feelings. Smith got out of his car, followed by Kathleen, who looked as pretty as a wild rose and seemed to be in a playful mood. "I just can't seem to pass this place," the rancher explained, putting his hand on Arquette's knee. "Look, son, and Marcia, don't you miss this?" "Don't worry, Dad," replied Marcia. "I was the one who first pointed this spot out to you." "It may be big and bare, but it's grand," exclaimed Kathleen. Marcia looked first at Arquette's face as he gazed out across the vast expanse of land. Did it still mean as much to him as it did before he went to war? She saw that it meant infinitely more to him and felt elated. Her faith in him was being confirmed. Then she looked out at the breathtaking view before her, knowing that it was a scene that could not be replicated anywhere in the world. The rolling hills were a beautiful sight to see, with their smooth green slopes and patches of brown squares. The valleys and hills stretched out as far as the eye could see, with few details to break up the vast expanse of green. The shadows of the setting sun cast ripples over the fields of wheat, like waves on an ocean. The month was June, and the beauty of the scenery was unparalleled. The hills seemed to go on forever, with the blue haze of the mountain range in the distance. The acres and miles of land were insignificant compared to the endless sea of green wheat. Smith and his family were in awe of the sight before them. Smith marveled at the thought of what the Germans would think if they could see the fields of wheat. Marcia saw the beauty in the scene, likening it to God's promise of life. Kathleen, wise beyond her years, appreciated the importance of the wheat fields and joked about picking out a husband from the young wheat sowers. Arquette, the patriarch of the family, felt a sense of contentment as he gazed out at the fields. The thought of his beloved son Jim, who had died in the war, weighed heavily on his mind. He hoped that his other son would follow in his footsteps and continue the family legacy. As twilight descended on the old home on the hill, Arquette stood alone at the window, lost in thought. With his head held high, he leaned against the window, his strength ebbing away. Marcia had left him alone, knowing what he needed. Suddenly a familiar feeling overtook him, like a snapback, and the gray forms of the Huns rushed towards him. He waited for the impact, as if he were standing on the ramparts of a trench. A ferocious storm brewed inside him, one that used to manifest in violence, but now churned like a hot wind through his veins. He relived his great fight for the 1,000th time, killing his foes over and over again. The storm passed through him without a single outward tremble. The Huns charged him again, bayoneting him once more, and he felt the acute pain in his left arm that was no longer there. He felt his hand close, even though it was gone. The Huns lay dead before him, their faces white and lifeless. They were forever damned by his ruthless spirit. He watched as the boy slid off the bayonet, beyond recall, murdered by some evil that Arquette had set in motion. Then the gray forms disappeared into the black abyss of Arquette's brain. "Marcia will never know how my Huns come back to me," he whispered. The night descended with its trains of stars, and the darkness enveloped the hills. It was a lonely, tranquil, and sweet night. A nightbird sang, and the faint hum of insects came to him like a sad melody of humanity from the strife-ridden world far away. The world of men was there, and life was incessant, monstrous, and inconceivable. This old house of his was filled with the sounds of his youth, of mice and crickets and leaves rustling against the roof, and the soft night wind at the eaves. These sounds brought his boyhood back to him, of his bare feet on the stairs, his father's aloofness and his mother's love. As he sat by the window, a gentle rustling sound caught his attention. Looking outside, he saw the wheat swaying back and forth, towering over him. The sound was familiar, evoking memories of his childhood, youth, and manhood. It was a growing sound, different from when the wheat was fully grown. It seemed to change and grow louder, as if carrying a deeper meaning. The night wind carried it, but there was something more to it, something powerful and driving. Beyond the wheat's growth and life was something vast and incomprehensible, infinite and universal. Arquette realized that this was the breath, blood, and spirit of both the wheat and humanity. Though their physical forms may return to dust, they were only fleeting moments on earth, giving birth to seeds and fulfilling a purpose that spanned the ages. As he pondered this, Marcia appeared by his side, her face illuminated by the starlight. Her presence and touch filled him with a sense of hope, lifting him above the darkness and pain of the present to a future of fertile fields and a golden age to come. The end. This concludes Western Whispers, a Washington State historical novel, written by Ken Cannon. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.